Right, we've done the beats and now it's time to move on to the bass. Now the bass is quite important in this track because obviously you need that kind of weight that all house music has. Now with this kind of tech house stroke kind of main room kind of stuff, it doesn't need to have a distinctive sound, it just needs to have a kind of presence within the mix. So the bass is really there and you can feel it. It kind of adds to the groove. With some subgenres of house, obviously the bass can be heard and it almost crosses the line into being a synth on its own. So it's a very characteristic of the track. But what we want is just something that's going to sit nicely in the mix, just add a bit of weight to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a brand new patch or preset for Sonic Academy's Anna synth. Now this can be any synth, and I'm using really basic features within this synth, so hopefully it will translate to just about any synth that you use. I'm also not against using a preset or any kind of patches for any other synths, because those are a great place to start, and depending on the mix that I'm doing, I might jump to one of them myself. It's just I'm just going to go from scratch with this, just so you can see how simple it is to kind of create that kind of sound, and then you'll kind of know how to go about, you know, either finding a patch or a preset that does the same, or making your own. So you know, we'll start off from the very basics here. I'm not going to get into anything too complicated. So we'll start off by just making this a sine wave. At the moment it's set as a saw. So we're going to make the first oscillator a sine wave. This will just make it really kind of nice and round and kind of warm. So that's kind of, yeah, just a nice kind of sound. It's quite high actually, so we're going to knock that down 1 octave. So you might be able to hear that, you might not. It's quite deep, but that adds a nice lot of weight to it, but nothing too much to the top end. Now we'll thicken that up with another sine wave. We'll turn that on by putting up 1 voice, and we'll leave that on the current octave. So there's 1 below it and 1 above it. So let's try that. So it already sounds quite thick. Now if we knock the cutoff down, you'll see that we'll get rid of some of the top end, and we'll just leave us with a nice bassy bit at the end. Yeah, that's kind of sounding quite nice, sounding quite like a real bass. And what we'll do is we'll add another. I want to add another oscillator on oscillator 3. We'll keep it with saw, so it's going to add a bit of rawness to it, just to kind of give it that little bit of edge. We'll put that 1 voice, that will turn it on, and we'll knock that down 1 octave. And we'll just fade the volume in as we play. I don't know if you can hear that, it's just adding a bit of edge to it. So that's kind of adding a bit to the track. Right, now before we do any more tweaks to this, it's rather than playing it on the keyboard, it's probably best if we kind of come up with some kind of patch, some kind of pattern, so we can just get it playing in the background. So I'm going to create a new MIDI clip on the bass channel. Now we want it to loop over just a couple of beats, so just over these couple of beats. So it will just keep looping over those. So I'm just going to create a little MIDI patch here. It's a MIDI clip. And that's already a loop, so we could just pull it out like that. There's nothing in it at the moment, but it's nice there and as a loop. So what we're going to do is open the clip up and start drawing some notes on. Now there's kind of 3 key areas to these kind of bass patterns. You usually have one on the start, one on the 1 beat, one on the kind of 3rd, and then one on the 5th or 6th. And what we're going to do is just draw them on it, and we can start playing around with them in these positions till we find a kind of pattern that we like. So I'll just start painting them on. There we go, it's just a few notes in there now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just knock off all the other percussion. So we just got the kick and the bass, and we can see how that sounds together. Okay, it's something to start with, but it's not great at the moment. So what we'll do is just keep moving these notes around and see how it sounds. Kind of a nice kind of melody going on there. Just something really simple in the background, just that we can kind of use to carry through. Right, it's getting a bit bassy and again a bit heavy, so I'm just going to lower all the levels so we're out of the red. Lower the bass because we really don't need it that loud. So let's just see how it sounds with all the percussion in as well. Underground, overground, underground, overground, underground, overground, underground. So it's definitely getting there. We got a kind of nice little kind of pattern going on here. And as I say, these notes you can move them around all over the place or get rid of them, but generally the positions of these notes are very consistent in most kind of tech house. So if I remove this one, for example, and drag it over, we'll see how this sounds. Overground, underground, overground, underground, overground, underground, overground, underground, overground, underground. Again, that's sounding quite nice, and we could keep that. But I might just revert to what we had to before. I think it's a bit more melodic. So we'll see how that goes. Right, the next step, we're going to EQ this. Now, there's a lot of bottom end there that we don't need, that's not going to be in the mix, and it's just going to muddy it up. It's going to get in the way of the kick, and it's just not going to sound great. So we'll start by putting an EQ in there, an EQ8. And what we're going to do is we're going to put it on the ×4 setting and then just drag it up. We're going to get rid of quite a bit of this bottom end. So let's try about there and see how that sounds. Overground, underground, overground, underground, overground, underground, overground, underground, overground, underground, overground, underground. So we can get quite a lot of the bottom end away, but still hear quite a lot of that bass coming through, and it's kind of disguised by the kick. The kick is what makes you think there's actually more bass there than there actually is. So as you can hear, we've still got a really nice sound to that bass, but it's not taking up as much room in the mix by getting rid of some of that bottom end. Right, next thing up to do is to get it out of the way of the kick. Now, obviously, the kick and the bass do hit at the same time in certain points. Now, this doesn't sound too bad at a low volume, but that's gonna really cause some problems on the frequency. So what we need to do is we need to duck the bass out of the way of the kick. Now, most people, I think, if you're into production, you probably already heard of side chaining. Now, that's where you use a compressor or some other method to duck the bass when the kick hits, so they're not both playing at the same time and they're not all kind of just getting all muddled. Now, we can do it with a side chain, and that's all brilliant. I'm sure you've seen a million tutorials on that. But one thing I do want to really get into, and I don't usually push third-party plugins, but this is the LFO tool from Xfer Records is just brilliant. It's a sidechain plugin, but without the need for the compressor. So when you add a compressor and you do sidechain compression, then it will affect the sound. However, with the LFO tool, all it does is just duck the volume, so you're not affecting the sound at all. You're not influencing that at all. So you're separated to what you can do with the bass. So you can do the compression somewhere else with the bass and make sure you got your bass sound sounding exactly how you want it, and then you do this afterwards, and that would then give you that kind of that ducking thing without adding any more compression or any more distortion onto it. Now there's some really good presets in this. If I just go straight to the presets menu, and there's the sidechain option here, I usually go straight for sidechain 6, which is a very kind of familiar pattern. This is basically just one beat of a bar. So you'd have your kick just here in this area, and that would be repeated again and again and again. So if I just play this, you'll see the playhead moving on it. So when the kick hits, this will lower this represents the volume of the bass. It will lower it down to this and then gradually increase it once the kick has kind of played. And you just adjust this until you find you've got the right settings for what you want. So if your kick drum is shorter, then you just decrease this, so you get a really it gets nearer and nearer to the kick. Or if you've got a longer kick drum, then you kind of just make it longer and longer. Now it's about there. I know this kick is it's probably about there, and I think that's probably going to sound about right. I've used the kick a few times, so I kind of know where to judge that. But as I say, you just keep playing around with this until you get it in the right order. Now I don't want this to duck all the way down to 0, so I'm just going to allow it to pass a bit through there, and we'll see how that sounds. Now you can hear there's already a kind of ducking sound going on. However, you're hearing some kind of clipping, and that's because when it gets to here, it just goes straight down. And what we need to do is just kind of put a nice kind of smooth kind of slope down to it. So we're just going to move this here, and there we go, clipping gone. So now this is not like a kind of miracle cure, but it does really help, and it gets it out of the way of the mix, and it's, you know, it frees it up, and you're not going to have so much problems with your bottom end. Right, so next up we're going to add a little bit of compression to this, just to kind of beef this sound up and maybe make it a little bit distorted. Now I know I said in the last thing obviously about sidechain compression, but this is doing compression to give it a bit of character, to give it a bit of kind of oomph and maybe a bit of distortion, just so we got some kind of more frequencies coming through. Now I'm just going to play with the inbuilt compressor within Ableton. So I'm just going to load one of them in there, and I'm going to put it before the LFO tool, because I don't want it having any effect after LFO tool, because there might be fragments that lead into the kick drum afterwards, and we don't want that. So I'm going to put it in there before. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep all the settings here as they are before, and I'm just going to lower the threshold until I get to something that sounds kind of nice, that kind of adds a bit more kind of oomph to it, gives it a bit more character. There you go. I think that gives it a kind of bit of rasp, kind of a bit of an edge. So hopefully that will sound nicely in the mix. So that's sounding quite nice, and we could just leave it there, and that would sound pretty good. I mean, you can just play around with these settings until you find something that you really like. And there's lots more settings on here that we can get into, and by adding a little bit of extra to it, then we can kind of make the bass sound fill more frequencies, and kind of make it sound a bit more real. So what we're going to do is kind of look at the noise parameter inside Anna. Now this kind of adds an extra element of noise, a pre-recorded element of noise, and it kind of you can just fade it in, and it will just create a kind of a bit more of a thicker sound. So what we're going to do is we're going to look through now these are the different types of sound, and what we're going to do is we're just going to fade them in using the volume and the filter, just so we can hear what they sound like along with the bass. There's a bit of noise there. See, just by putting something simple like that in, it's a bit of it's called chime noise, so it's got a kind of a percussion-y kind of chime to it anyway, and it's got the noise in there that gives it a bit of grit. But just adding that in there gives it a bit more kind of dynamic, a bit more unique, and it kind of creates a really nice kind of thick sound there. As I say, we could go on and we could keep tweaking all these. There's so many different settings down here that I'm just finding out about them all and learning them all at the moment. But you feel free to just go through and just try all the settings and see what you can come up with. The more you kind of play around, the more you find, and the more you kind of learn how your synth works. So I thoroughly recommend that. But that's it for the bass, I think. We might come back and tweak that a bit later on, depending on how it sits in the mix. But next, we're going to go into an arrangement.